Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli. Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
La civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to all of you here in person and online. So thank you very much for following us. I am Mattia Ferraresi. I am the chief editor of newspaper Domani, and I have the privilege to moderate this dialogue entitled Between Democracy and Autocracy, the Fate of Freedom, with two extraordinary guests that will guide us in this conversation. And we are going to talk about probably the biggest challenge of our times, not only in political terms, but also in cultural terms. To my right, we have Shadi Hamid, a writer and journalist, academician. A few days ago, he was designated as new member of the editorial board of the Washington Post. He will also be a writer for that, and he was a senior fellow at the Brookings institution, a very important think tank in Washington. So round of applause for our high-profile guest, Shadi Hamid. And please keep another round of applause for the other guest, Mikhail Shishkin, Russian writer and journalist. And so writer and journalist. He grew up in Moscow, but he has been living from the mid-90s in Switzerland. He won so many awards that if I were to read the whole list, we would stay here for the rest of the day. So Russian National Bestseller, big book. And last year, he won the Strega, European Strega Prize. Is a very well-known voice, authoritative voice when it comes to the debate around Russia, and is a well-known dissident voice. So, democracy and autocracy, so many topics at stake. We may address this topic from many points of view, but I'm a journalist, unfortunately, and I want to deal with some recent event coming from the chronicles of this war. And I want to say something about what we all know, the death of Prigozhin. And, well, it has almost been confirmed. Well, there's evidence of that, of what happened. Well, he was one of the leaders of this sort of mutiny, of sort of attempted coup. And well, it's not about talking, the details of the event, but here the provocation is, until some months ago, it seemed that a character like Prigozhin or other players in this war may seem to be one of the authors of the collapse from the inside of Putin's regime. Well, this is a speculation that has been made several times so that regimes can collapse because also of internal feuds, not just because of, exogenous factors. But here, another opponent has been eliminated, even if we don't know yet all the details. So my first question to Mikhail is this, to know his take about this speculation, maybe this sort of delusional thought that we had, that maybe there could be this sort of shift promoted by internal figures challenging the authority of the head of the regime. Mikhail. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation to this wonderful meeting. Before answering your question on Prigozhin, I would like to say two things that are very important to me. This monstrosity, this war, is not just against Ukraine. It is a war of Putin's regime against Russia, against the Russian language and the Russian culture. Putin's regime made my culture, my language, a language of murderers for the whole world. To me, it's very important to be here today and talk in Russian. And I will never, ever somehow give my language to Putin. I will never, ever give up my language because of Putin. I will never give up to it. And I will fight for the Russian culture as part of the world culture. Well, as to Prigozhin, in order to understand why 2 months ago a group of armed people led by Prigozhin went towards Moscow with no resistance, well, the people were greeting this Wagner army. And the army didn't want to fight against the Wagner group. So we need to understand how Russia is. Well, all the most important Russian issues, who is to blame, what to do. Well, these are the big questions of the literature of the 19th century, the big questions also for the readers of that literature. 150 million of Russian farmers were illiterate. For them, the most important Russian question was, is, and probably will ever be, was the Tsar authentic or not? Well, that's the main Russian question. If the Tsar is authentic, well, there will be order. Instead, if it's a fake, there will be anarchy, chaos, disorder. Understanding if the Tsar is authentic or not is possible only through the winner, through victory. Stalin killed millions of people, but he won. That's why the Russian population still loves him. Gorbachev lost the Cold War against the Western world. He lost the Afghanistan war, so it was not a real Tsar. So till today, he's deconsidered. well, no election in Russia will have the same power of this consideration. So to legitimate the power, the victory is the only means. That's why Putin started his government with the war in Chechnya, and then he became the real and legitimate Tsar after the Crimea accession in 14. And so the Tsar had to keep sustaining his legitimacy through victories. And the generals promised him that he would conquer Kiev in 3 days. If Putin had known how things would go, probably he would have never started it. Today, to the eyes of the population, he lost his legitimacy. He is not a real Tsar. So now a new Tsar is being searched, is being looked for. And so suddenly Prigozhin appears, and he was strong. He seemed to fill all the boxes. He was the only one to have won battles in this war. And on top of that, he had moved towards Moscow to get to the power. The whole population of Russia was ready to see him become the new Tsar of Russia. But maybe the one having doubts about it was Prigozhin himself, because from a mindset point of view, well, he showed that he was not ready for the power that he would have the chance to conquer. And now, well, there was the punishment, the revenge. So, but the Putin era is about to end. And now a battle is going on to get the power after Putin. What happened yesterday, so is killing, is something I had been waiting for 2 months. What's going to happen next? Well, we can figure that out easily. As soon as Putin will disappear, and is sick, he's already sick, he never leaves his refuge, his bunker. And the whole Russian population knows that the images they saw on TV is just his doppelganger. It's just his double. So clearly, there will be a sort of de-Putinization of Russia, and that will lead to a new Putin. Putin will be accused of having lost, and the new Putin will have to prove his legitimacy through a victory. But it won't be a victory vis-à-vis Ukraine. The new Putin will acknowledge the loss of, and having lost the war, and the old Putin will be, so will acknowledge the defeat. Putin will be to blame, and the new Putin will gain legitimacy through his battle against the other Putins. So I ask you the same question. Well, the same question, Shadi. I don't want to know about the details. It's not even your main domain or area of interest. But what Mikhail said seemed to suggest some reflections and remarks about the strength and weakness of authoritative regimes. Well, a few days ago, we had a chat, and you told me this. Authoritative regimes are resilient, but it doesn't mean that they're strong authoritarian regimes. Can you please develop a bit on that, elaborate on that? Because this seems to be in the same line as what Mikhail said. Thank you.
Yeah, so The fundamental question of politics is who rules and under what authority. And based on what we just heard Mikhail saying, we don't know what's going to happen in the future in Russia. There's going to be a fight over power. And this shows the inherent weakness and instability of authoritarian regimes. They don't have an answer, a good answer, to the fundamental question of politics. There's always a kind of confusion about who will rule after the dictator. How do you transfer power? How do you move on from a big figure like Putin? However bad he is, he's a force of nature. What do you do after that? That's the open question. And this is why I think that those of us who live in democracies, first of all, we should be very thankful that we do. And every time we look at a country like Russia or even China under President Xi Jinping, there is something that we have that they don't, which is the ability to rotate power through elections. Granted, we don't always feel great about our democracies. I'm American, and there's a lot of doom and gloom about American politics now. There is a real risk that Trump might win in 2024, and that's worrying, obviously. But there is a resilience at the core of our democratic societies, precisely because we can change our mind. We can choose different leaders every 4 or 5 years. And I think that this is at the heart of what is fundamentally different. Autocracies are not comparable to democracies. And I think that that's really, we'll talk more about these fundamental differences, but I think that's a place where we can start.
Assolutamente. Grazie Shadi. Ma infatti
Thank you, Shadi. Let's broaden up the scenario beyond this with this targeted reference to this case. Over the last few years, we have seen in the political debate the idea of the democratic backsliding. So the idea was that democracy are backsliding, and I think that an incredible high number of books have been published on this, on the crisis of democracy, or democracy being declining, being at the end, being backsliding, being sick. Recently, well, really over the last few months, it seems, well, that there's something different. There's a different narrative, and so there seems to be a sign of hope. So there seems to be a democracy comeback. So the democratic ideas seem to strike back. And again, this probably is linked up also to the war in Ukraine and what's happening with all its consequences, as Shadi said. Biden, as well, some months ago, around March, well, he gathered an event on democracy and said, well, the tide is changing. He talked about the turning of the tide. Do you believe in that? Do you see the same thing? So is there some improvement on the horizon? Well, this seems to be the common sentiment when it comes also to the public in general. So democracy that has been so much criticized and attacked and considered as dead, well, seems to come back. And so people seem to regain the worth of democracy. Mikhail. Well, democracy to me is not heaven. Democracy to me is more about the possibility to fight for democracy. As Shadi said, dictatorships do not give people the opportunity to have their say and to choose their leaders. Instead, well, democracy can have an impact on the power. When you live in a democracy, you can, because politicians, well, are indifferent somehow if there is a war or if it's not a war. They're interested just in the next elections. And so they depend on the people to be elected, and so they listen to the public opinion. And through mass media, you can have an impact on the voters, and so you can somehow have an impact and an influence on the power. But in Russia, all this is not possible. Instead, in Switzerland, I saw how democracy works over the years. Well, on TV, in the newspapers, I somehow wrote and talked about the need to fight against Putin's regime. And I also had my say against the Swiss neutrality, but with no results. At the end of the day, there was the invasion on February the 24th. And the president of Switzerland said, well, we are a neutral country. We want to support the sanctions against Russia. And on February the 25th, I publicly talked on TV, and I joined one of the most important Swiss political talk shows called Arena. And I said, dear Switzerland, well, the time of neutrality is over. And I said everything I thought about that topic. And probably that was the last straw on voters, because the next day, the president of Switzerland said, well, for the very first time in its history, Switzerland gives up its neutrality and will support the sanctions against Russia. That's the difference between a dictatorship and a democracy. When there's a democracy, well, a democracy is a constant fight and battle for democracy.
Shadi.
Yes, so for those of us who live in free societies, freedom cuts both ways. And we also have the freedom to panic and to be worried about our own society. That's why, if you look, we're always consumed by our own decline, especially Americans. If you look at American intellectual debates since the 60s onwards, it's been almost the same thing every decade. America has reached its peak, and now it is declining. But in some ways, the very fact that we can express those fears is positive. In autocratic regimes, no one has the freedom to talk about the decline of their own country. And that lack of openness, I think, is a weakness. In the case of America and other democracies, because we can be open with our criticism, we can always be putting pressure to improve and to be more dynamic. So I think that this is another one of the benefits that is becoming more apparent. And I would also just say, just to shift maybe the focus a little bit outside of Russia, because China is often talked about as a benevolent dictatorship. And in the US, I think sometimes there's a fantasy, if only we could be more technocratic, more efficient, more effective. During COVID, China was making hospitals, instant hospitals, in 5 or 6 days. And some of us as Americans thought, why can't we be more like that? But if you wait longer, you see the cost of what China has, because their economy has grounded to a halt. And you've probably read a lot of the articles over the past few weeks and months talking about the Chinese economic bubble. The so-called Chinese miracle is no longer a miracle. So basically, authoritarian regimes, they seem better than they actually are, while democratic regimes we seem worse than we actually are. We seem worse in the moment, but if you wait and you try not to panic too much, you see this deeper resilience. And that to me is really the contrast that is becoming more apparent now. So when Biden talks about democracy making a recovery, I think he's right. Obviously, there's a propaganda aspect. He wants to be able to say that, but there is a fundamental truth here that many of these autocratic regimes, they're almost like, so we have a candy in the US, I presume it's here too in Italy, M&Ms.
We have it.
Yeah, you have them, okay. So they seem tough on that, they're hard on the outside, but once you bite in, they're kind of mushy and soft, basically. And I think that that analogy can help us maybe visualize how autocratic regimes operate. So in that sense, I'm not one of the intellectuals who is so self-critical. There's almost a kind of self-contempt if you talk to certain left-leaning American thinkers and intellectuals. It's almost like they don't even believe in the American idea anymore, and they've accepted the inevitability of our own decline. That is something that is very common in American public debate right now, especially on the left side of the spectrum. I'm much more bullish about America for the reasons I just laid out, because the strengths of democracy become more apparent over time, even if they're not obvious in the very moment that we're in right now.
Però facciamo un passo indietro.
Let's make a step back, but I start from you, Shadi. So let's make a step back. So with the end of the Cold War, an idea seems to gain ground. So the hypothesis about the end of history, so not only democracy or the collapse of Marxism in its Soviet form as big alternative to liberalism and the market economy, so collapse. And so liberalism affirms itself as a more efficient winning model that gains over the possible sort of adversary and alternative. But there is another idea that starts circulating, that the history is over. So there is no, sort of dialogue or possible alternatives. And so democracy is the one and only universal fate of humankind. So in a nutshell, that was the idea that circulated at that time, at the end of the Cold War. But actually, that resulted to be pretty problematic, because we saw some extreme consequences of that. We should never, ever forget when democracy, there was an attempt to export democracy through force, through weapons, or, any people, any context, any culture seemed to be, suitable for democracy. So bringing out to them some features of liberal systems. And, some of these attempts have been pretty traumatic. So we should not forget this. I start with you, Shadi. So I changed the order. So, okay. So democracy is more resilient, okay. But this idea of democracy as inevitable and benevolent fate of destiny that is inevitable, and that, we need to be grateful and be nothing but happy. But was it totally true? Was there a democratic disappointment after the Cold War? Yes or no? That's just an idea.
So first of all, I would say that nothing is inevitable, and there's a danger that when we see something as inevitable, we become complacent. And if we look at the 1990s, I think there was a kind of ideological complacency. That said, I do think that democracy is available to all cultures, but I think we have to separate between two concepts. Democracy as a system of government and liberalism, or the classical liberal tradition, as an ideological orientation. They don't always go together, and I think the mistake of the post-Cold War was combining these two concepts and treating them as interchangeable. Democracy doesn't necessarily lead to good outcomes all the time. And as Mikhail said, democracy is not heaven. You have to accept trade-offs. Sometimes the politicians who you don't like or even hate might come to power. And I think I'm born and raised in the US, but originally Egyptian, and we saw some of this during the Arab Spring. The Muslim Brotherhood won consecutive elections during the Arab Spring in Egypt, and they are not a liberal party. They are either considered anti-liberal or post-liberal and so forth. But part of the challenge of democracy is accepting outcomes that you don't like or that you feel are personally threatening. So I, for example, was very critical of the military coup in Egypt that ousted the elected government of Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, because you can't have it both ways. If you believe in democracy, you have to respect the results. If Trump, God forbid, wins in 2024, fair and square, I, as an American, will have to learn to live with that outcome. If far-right parties win in Western European countries, as a Muslim myself, I find them to be quite frightening. But if they win fair and square, that has to be respected, whether it's the AfD in Germany or the National Front in France or the Brothers of Italy right here in Italy. So I think that this has become a universal challenge as democracy and liberalism diverge, because many of these right-wing populist parties in Europe are often seen as post-liberal, or they're not fully committed to the classical liberal tradition. We can maybe debate whether or not that is accurate, but that's certainly a perception that we have. So I think it's very important to be clear about our concepts. And we shouldn't always think of democracy as a package that, because if we go to, say, a religiously conservative society in the Middle East and we say, if you want to be good Democrats, you also have to be good liberals and accept the full package of gender equality and the full protection of minority rights. We as Westerners might want that and like that, but that's not necessarily what people are going to vote for in these societies. And I think at some level, we have to come to terms with that reality. And that's why I think it's really important to accept the differences in concepts, as I've just mentioned.
Ma quindi, scusa, metti un attimo no, è solo...
So can we say, is it correct to say that there is an idealized conception of democracy and a sort of realistic notion of democracy? Could we say that? So distinguishing between a realistic notion of democracy and an idealistic, it's a yes-no question. Yes or no, can we say that there is?
I just want people to readjust their expectations. Democracy is not going to solve all of your problems. The goal is much more minimalistic, and this is what I've discussed in my own writing, where I propose an idea called democratic minimalism, because I want to just...
Ti fermo qua perché ci torno dopo.
I'll go back to this in a second. I just wanted a yes or no answer. Thank you. Mikhail, what do you think about this distinction that Shadi just shared and proposed to us?
Я вообще редко говорю оптимистически.
Well, I'll try to express my optimism because I'm an optimistic person, but when it comes to the possibility of development of democracy on the planet, I'm optimistic. So humankind develops according to its own laws. You have laws from physics. Well, all rivers, sooner or later, end up in the sea or in the oceans. So sooner or later, all peoples will reach a sort of democratic organization and establishment of their countries. 100 years ago, well, we still had people killing each other brutally. And so the strongest ones killed the weakest ones, and humanity develops according to its own laws, the laws of humanity. Instead, today, we have laws protecting the weak ones against the strong ones. That's the essence of democracy. You can live more comfortably and easily with democracy. Instead, when there is a dictatorship, somebody can come to you and take everything away from you. When there is a dictatorship, well, with the democracy, the state will defend and protect you if you are weak. So the Russian oligarchs with Putin tried to invest in the Western world and not in Russia. They bought real estate, big boats, and a lot of stuff in the Western world, because if maybe today you are an oligarch like Mikhail in Russia, but you can lose everything tomorrow and be in prison. Well, in the Western world, even now, well, democratic states defend and protect. So the money and the properties of Putin sort of oriented oligarchs. That is why I am convinced that all peoples sooner or later will reach democracy. But maybe, well, the situation has become like that. Historically, for some countries, the road is shorter. Instead, for other countries like Russia, this pathway is much, much longer, or it goes through, you know, round turnings. But sooner or later, Russians will understand that living in democracy is better than living in a dictatorship. I want to ask you something about this. And so I link up with what you said before. You said that, I mean, there will be another Putin after Putin, as if there was a system much, much stronger than even the leader, so that even eliminating a leader is not enough. It's not enough to change the key fundamental features of the regime. Now, you expressed some hope in your speech, in your argument. But let's go maybe back to some realism, so maybe to some darker notes. But I would like to better understand. So on the one hand, there is some hope for a change. But on the other, well, you seem to say that in spite of what is happening, a change of leadership that may be a realistic short-term goal. Well, you are saying that probably really considering the current situation, even a change of leadership would not automatically guarantee a real regime change. Could you please elaborate a bit more on this? So democracy is made of some strong elements, but it has a soft spot. It is very fragile, actually. And conditions may occur so that people may be sort of willingly available to give up their freedom and accept a dictatorship. In the course of history, for instance, in the 20s in Germany, we have seen that happen. So dictatorship came along, not because a dictator imposed himself. I mean, I cannot imagine, for instance, in Switzerland or in Bern, in front of the parliament, somebody coming out of the building of the parliament and say, oh, from today onwards, I'm your dictator. Well, I think they would simply consider him as a madman, and they would get rid of him. But instead, that's what's happened in Russia. And in Germany, it happened differently. So dictatorship started, resulted from chaos. Well, and when people want order, they seem to think that only a strong hand can make order be restored. We saw how Hitler got the power. He got it in an absolutely democratic way. And the vast majority of the population voted for Putin in Russia. So I may also quote more democratic countries, like Germany or like Italy. Well, something may happen, may be the result of terrorist attacks, so that would lead to a request from the population of a strong hand. We saw that during the pandemic, and Shadi mentioned that as well. America is a democratic country, but still it seemed to want, at that point in time, a dictatorship. So that is why in Russia, when Putin will disappear, chaos will start. Nobody wants to live in chaos. And so the population will ask for order. Well, let's imagine free elections in Russia, something wonderful, really free election. And from abroad, the foreign agents come back, the betrayers like Kasparov, Khodorkovsky, and let's imagine that they say, well, we will have democracy again in Russia. What will the population respond to that? No, we already had democracy in the 90s, and it was just chaos and anarchy. Or maybe Strelkov will come out of prison. He's the main enemy of Ukraine, but he was put in jail nevertheless. You know that, because he's a political prisoner now. And you will say, come on, let's build the great Russia again. So let's make this country be great again. We do not want democracy. We want order. So in your opinion, who would win such free elections? I have more questions than answers. So I come back to you, and maybe you can help us better understand some analogies with the Middle East, your main area of interest. So are the dynamics mentioned by Mikhail the same? Can you please try to answer the same question, but referring to your main area of interest, so the Middle East? Thank you.
Chaos is always a danger, and we saw this in Egypt and Tunisia in particular. Tunisia actually had a somewhat long period of democratic transition, which has now been ending, and it's now being reconstituted as a dictatorship under Kais Saied. But part of the reason there is because democracy didn't produce real economic progress and development. And I think that the expectations of Tunisians were raised considerably. There was so much hope and euphoria around the Arab Spring, and a lot of us fell into this. If you look at American commentators and observers, there was this sense that democracy was the future and that Tunisians had chosen. But chaos and a sense that things aren't improving, as we've been talking about, does lead to a desire for a strong hand. We saw this under Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. The economy wasn't doing well. So what do we do with this information? I think one key thing is readjusting expectations, whether we're talking to people in the Middle East or Russia or even to ourselves. Democracy doesn't necessarily lead to economic improvement right away. That's not what democracy is for. It can lead to that, but it's not a foregone conclusion. And that's why I go back to this minimalist idea, because if we tell people that democracy is heaven and it's not heaven, there's going to be a profound disillusion. So we have to do this readjustment when we think about what democracy can offer people. But I think there's also an internet.
Slow down a little bit.
Sorry?
Can you slow down a little bit? I think.
Slow down?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I sometimes speak fast. Okay. I'll help the translators here. So, and just the other thing I would say is that there's an international component. Unfortunately, my country, America, doesn't do a good job of supporting democracy in certain regions of the world. During the Cold War, we supported right-wing dictators against the threat of communism. That, I think, is a moral stain on America's record. And then during the Arab Spring in the Middle East, President Obama, the Obama administration, gave what amounted to a green light to General Sisi to proceed with his military coup. And not to get into that too much, but I think that there's often a sense that Western democracies were hypocritical. We don't practice what we preach. And we do like this idea of having the one strong man who we can do business with, because that's easier than the chaos. So when we want to understand why the Middle East has gone in this very dark direction, yes, Arabs have agency, and individual Arabs made choices. Politicians, leaders, opposition groups made bad choices. But I would argue that also Western democracies made bad choices as well, and that made the environment more conducive to a return to autocratic regimes. So I think there's quite a bit of blame to go around, and sometimes it's important, and I often tell American audiences this, don't go and think that Arabs or Muslims can't get their act together, or they're an undemocratic people with an undemocratic culture. That, I think, is a way of not looking at our own share of the blame, and I think there's enough blame to go around.
Grazie, Shadi.
Thank you very much, Shadi. Mikhail, when we talk about democracy or dictatorships or authoritative regimes or disillusions about, promises that were not kept, or if we talk about regimes like the Russian one, well, we can do nothing but think about the parable written by Solzhenitsyn, great dissident who spent his life, challenging, fighting against the Soviet regime. And the second half of his life, when he goes to the US, he delivers a famous speech. He delivered many, but in Harvard at the end of the 70s, he says, and it has become historic, yes, I spent my whole life fighting against the Russian regime, the Soviet regime, but, well, in the American liberal model, in the Western model, well, if I had to say it, it's not a valid alternative model. And so then he goes on with strong criticism on some aspects of, this liberal model, of the Western liberal model. And, well, there will be many consequences of that. But I would like to submit to you this very same dilemma, so this tension. Also, considering what Shadi just said, so insisting on the fact that, as Shadi said, we need to change our expectations, to adjust them with respect to what democracy and democratic system can give to us. We can't ask them for what they can't give us. Well, then things may get nasty and complicated. So what's your point of view? Well, of course, I mean, when you're faced with a regime, you tend to think that an immediate option to an open and democratic system based on the rule of law, based on the protection of key fundamental rights set forth by the law is the most desirable option, isn't it? Well, I don't want to preach in favor of Solzhenitsyn. He's a man who did a lot. He did something extraordinary in order to make the Soviet regime collapse. So his mission in history is clear, and he succeeded in what he did. But then there's another question opening up. Well, when the communist regime is there any longer, how can democracy be introduced in Russia if all the communists are still there? Figure out this. Germany of 45. And let's imagine that Hitler is killed in that attempted murder. But let's imagine that the Allies pose a condition. Peace, but in exchange of a denazification. And to denazify, well, the denazification must be carried out by the Nazi and the Gestapo. So in Russia, there was a sort of decommunization process. So there was the need to get rid of the chefs and the heads of the Communist Party and of the KGB. So what kind of democracy could they build up, these people? Now, well, then there was the recovery of dictatorship. I think that maybe it would have been possible to avoid all that. Russian population was ready for democracy, but they didn't know what it was. They just watched American films, and that was it. So for them, democracy was McDonald's plus constitution, plus American cars, plus free elections. So how could the Western world help the young Russian democracy? Only in one way, so showing how a rule of law works. How does democracy and a democratic country works? But instead, the Western world didn't do it. Well, they should have shown that there are rules, and if you, breach the law, you go in prison. In the 90s and beginning of the 2000, I worked as interpreter and translator, and I saw how politicians, lawyers from the Western world were happy about the huge amount of dirty money coming from Russia. They knew that they were breaching laws, they were infringing laws. And in the Western world, when it is about money, well, the rule of law ends. And then that's the idea that the Russians got of democracy. Without the proper kind of support from the Western world, so that was the outcome that we had. So if a good support, we would have never had a dictatorship. Instead, so the Western world saw that an oppressor was rising, but they turned a blind eye. And that's a big mistake of the Western world, because this monster, this beast was created with their complacency. And now the Western world, who was responsible for that, needs to fix it and help the Ukraine people win over the Putin regime, because the responsibility of the Putin regime, the responsibility is the lack of democracy and the defects of democracies in the Western world. This is part of the problem. I want to add another element, and then I'll give the word to Shadi if he wants to answer this question. Yes, I want to add an element of complication to what Mikhail said. I think that a relevant event of the last 18 months of war, something important, well, that happened is, the positions of the rest of the world. So the Western world reunited and took a clear stance in favor of the Ukrainian cause, because it's about a more universal cause, about defending and promoting some key rights and democracy. It's not just about protecting a specific people, but the rest of the world, well, according to what we see from the political reactions, is more, for Russia. So the global South, well, is generally speaking more in favor of Russia. We have seen the recent BRICS summit, and Putin was the protagonist, even though he was not there in person, and it was dominated by Xi Jinping and China, who wants to expand even more. That's today's news. So, well, brutally, the vast majority of mankind took a stance in favor of Russia. So this is an additional element for you, Shadi, just for a last reply, and then again to Mikhail, and then we will close. Back to you.
So you raise a really important point, that the democracies of the global South have not taken the position we may have wanted them to. And I have to say, I'll just be straight up here, I think it's somewhat absurd for young democracies in the global South to prioritize Russia or China. Some of it's about money, and maybe that's understandable, but when it's ideological, this is what I feel very uncomfortable with, because for all of America's faults, for all of the faults of the Western-led order, if you compare the Western-led order to an imagined world where China is the sole superpower, I guess I would just say be careful what you wish for. And I think that we take what we have for granted when we have it, and we try and we start kind of having these intellectual exercises of, oh, what would it be like if China was the world power? Maybe that would be nicer somehow. But if we look at China's extremely aggressive conduct to anyone who doesn't agree with them, and its desire to impose an authoritarian model, what happens inside of a country affects its foreign policy outside. So if China prioritizes an almost totalitarian regime at home, they're going to want to see that in other countries over time. So I think the US and European powers have to become much more cognizant of this disconnect with the global South. And at some level, I get it. Because of the history in Latin America, because we've been so hypocritical and inconsistent. And that's why instead of hoping for a world where America is no longer dominant, I say something different. I say let's hope for a world where America is dominant, but it becomes less hypocritical and becomes more consistent with its own values in the global South, in Latin America, in Africa, and in the Middle East. That's what we should aspire to.
Mikhail, lascio a te.
Mikhail, I leave you the very last word on this final remark.
Отвечая на ваш вопрос, почему
Well, I'll try to answer your question. Why so many people in the world support Putin? Unfortunately, mankind lives according to a very old adage. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Many people in the world, and not just in Africa, but also in Europe, in Italy, do not like the US, do not like NATO for different reasons. For them, well, for these people against the US and NATO, well, they have different interests, but unfortunately, that's the way things are. But as soon as Putin, from being a strong warrior against NATO, will become a loser, losing the war in Ukraine, well, probably these people will look for another hero, another Putin that is going to be against the US and NATO. Well, I'd like to thank you very much. Unfortunately, time has run out. I would like to continue, but it's not possible. But I think that as a final closure, I can say that this dialogue contributed to somehow embody once again the vocation of the meeting as a place and a forum of dialogue and exchange, of friendship, as this year's edition's title says. And so this is possible thanks to the contribution of many people and also to the many donors that support this event. So please do not stop to donate and reach any Donate Now desk characterized by the red heart, and please donate. And remember that the meeting is a third sector entity, and also you can get tax breaks if you donate. So that was just a technical announcement, but a big round of applause for Mikhail Shishkin and Shadi Hamid. Thank you for being with us. Thank you very much indeed.
Civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli